I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome back to the Lazy Angle Basics series. In this next video in the Basics series, we're going to continue working on our beach ball quilt. In our previous video, I showed you how to use the jumbo Lazy Angle ruler to cut your A and B pieces for your beach balls. We then went ahead and pieced them, and where we left off is that we have our units. So now that you have all of your units, go ahead and lay them out on a design wall or on the floor, following the layout diagram in the pattern. I've gone ahead and put mine up on my design wall here. The next step is we are going to take 4 of them and sew them together to create a block. So I'm going to take my upper left corner and head on over to my sewing machine. I have my 4 pieces, and I'm simply going to sew my top 2 together and my bottom 2 together to make 2 small rows, and then sew them together in a 4 patch to make my block. And place them right sides together, and I have the same machine settings from the last video, which is my scant 1/4 inch, so that everything measures perfect once it's sewn into my piece. Repeat with my second pair. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew back onto my scrap. And now I could turn my iron on, or I can press these with my seam roller. I love a seam roller. It really comes in handy for small things like this when you are at the machine. So I'm simply going to flip this one over. And again, I'm going to press this seam open so that it lays nice and flat. We'll minimize the bulk in my finished quilt. And do the same with the top half. And now I want to put these together to finish my block. I generally don't pin a lot, but I do find that it can be helpful to pin at this point to make sure that that center seam stays together. So if you find that helpful, go ahead and pin as well. Simply going to line them up on top of each other. And place a pin to hold it right where it is in the middle there. When you get close, you want to take your pin out. It's never a good idea to sew over pins, not good for your machine. Go ahead and check, make sure everything lined up pretty well. If not, go ahead and take the seam out and fix it. And simply going to press this seam open as well. I like to use my seam roller when I'm at my machine, but once I have all of my blocks done, I do like to turn on the iron and give them a good press. Pressing is up and down. Ironing is moving the iron, and that can do things like stretch bias and distort blocks. So you want to go ahead and make sure you're pressing, which is up and down, and not ironing. I like to press from the back and then flip the block over and press from the front as well. And now that I have that block pieced and pressed, I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to my design wall. And I'm going to repeat those steps to piece all of my blocks together. I've now pieced all of my units into blocks and put my blocks back up on my design wall. I do suggest taking a camera to take a photo of your layout, just in case things get mixed matched. You can always go back and refer to that photo. I did it more than once when putting my blocks up on my wall here. And now I'm going to take the blocks and sew them together into rows. I'm going to use the same technique to match the seams here that I did when matching these seams. The only thing I really want to make sure here is that I have those points lining up. So I will show you a quick technique called the hang pin, just to make sure those points perfectly line up. So we'll take those first 2 blocks and head on over to the machine. So we have these 2 blocks, and we're going to go ahead and sew our 1/4 inch seam here. But if you are worried about these points, say for instance they're not perfectly 1/4 inch in and you're worried you're going to either lose your points or have too much, of your background, I'm going to show you a hang pin technique. I've shown this a couple times, but if you haven't seen it before, it can be very useful to help make sure points line up from one piece to another. So we're going to begin by folding our two pieces right sides together the way we're going to sew them. And then we're going to take one straight pin and we're going to place it right where the point is. So right where all of our pieces of fabric come together, right at that point. I'll wiggle it around so you can kind of see it. Okay. And then we're going to take that same pin and we're going to go right in where these points match up here. And we're going to hold these two pieces together and we're going to let this pin hang there. That's why it's called hang pin. And what's important is we want to keep this pin perpendicular to our seam. So we want to make sure it doesn't go this way or this way and that it stays nice and straight. And then we're going to get two more straight pins and we're going to place one on either side of the hang pin. And now that we have that done, we can remove our hang pin because it would prevent us from sewing if it stayed in there. So we can remove our hang pin and go ahead and sew our 1/4 inch and hopefully our points perfectly line up. Make sure none of our seams flip. We're going to keep things nice and pressed open. Take out our pins as we go. This is another good opportunity to use a stiletto if you would like to help make sure things stay nice and lined up. And with our needle here, we're going to aim right for that point. Take out our other pin and finish the seam. And there we go. Things line up pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process to sew all the blocks together in this row. So now that I have these first two blocks together, I'm going to go ahead and put it back on my design wall, make sure everything's in the right place, grab my third block and continue using the same process to piece each row. I have completed piecing each row and I now have 5 rows and it's time to go ahead and put those rows together. Now you could just go ahead, put the 2 rows together, sew all the way across, hope everything lines up. Or what you can do is you can take those 2 rows, put them together, head back to the machine and do some hang pin, which is what we just did to make sure that our blocks lined up with each other in the rows. So I'm going to head to the machine and I'm going to do the hang pin here, 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 and here. 4 places where the points of my beach balls line up from one row to the other. And then I'm just going to sew about an inch, inch and a half at each of those locations. Make sure that all my points line up, and then I will sew the length of my piece without removing that thread. I'll show you how we do that. So just as we did the hang pin for sewing this block to this block, we're going to go ahead and do that for our rows. So again, quick refresher, we're going to stick our pin right where our pieces come together. And then we are going to stick it in the same location on the other side. And then we are going to push the pin through and let it hang there, hence why we call it hang pin. And then take 2 additional pins and make sure that that stays nice and perpendicular so that our points are going to stay lined up. And then we'll take 2 additional pins, 1 on either side, and we're going to repeat that at each of the 4 points. One quick note before I pin my last one is you might be wondering why we're not doing this as well at these intersections. And the answer is because they're not as important. It's, you know, you'd like them to line up as well as possible, but it's not as important to pin these because it's all background fabric. So if they're off slightly, it's okay because the shape is still going to be what it needs to be. So we're just going to focus on where points meet up with points. So I'm going to pin this last one just like I pinned the previous 3. And now, as I mentioned, instead of sewing the entire length of this, which we could do, but if something ends up off, then we'd have to take out all of our stitches with a seam ripper, we're just going to sew about an inch at each one of the areas that I pinned, and then I'm going to open it up, check, and if everything's good, just go ahead and sew my piece. If not, I can just unpick whichever one needs a little bit of help to be perfect. So I'm just going to take out my pins as I go. nice and slow, just about an inch, so about a half an inch on either side of the intersection. Make sure you take out your pins as you go. You never want to sew over pins. When you're aiming for your needle to land right where your point is, sometimes that is a little more generous or a little less generous than a 1/4 inch, and that's okay. That's what pinning like this is going to allow us to make those accommodations. Make sure everything's nice and flat. I generally find that a little bit of extra time here at this step saves me more time down the road. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up and let's check to see how we did. All right, that one's pretty good. That one's okay. Looks like I lost a little bit of the point of this one. I might fix that. That one's pretty good. And that one is great. So yeah, I think I'm going to take a second just to fix this one. Somehow I lost a little bit of the point of the one, and I'd rather just take a couple seconds to just take out these few stitches and fix this one before going ahead and sewing the entire seam. And this is definitely a judgment call. This is how close is good enough for you, and only you can decide that. And sometimes when that happens, I originally did the pinning from this side. Sometimes when that happens, I like to do the pinning from the other side. For some reason, I find that if I have a mistake and then I pin it from the other side, I tend to have more success than the first go. Not really sure why, but that is what I have. All right, so again, put my pin in. And as you can see there, this blue is definitely down from where that blue is. And that, you know, it also kind of makes sense because if you look here, that's not perfectly straight. But things like that are going to happen. None of us are perfect. So tips like this help us to accommodate for our imperfections and kind of make up and get things as back on track as they can be. At the end of the day, though, if you lose a point or two, that's okay. Nothing is perfect. It was made by a human, and it should look like it was made by a human. Let's see how that turned out this time. Yeah, much better. I now have all of my points, and that looks great. So I'm now just going to go ahead and sew the length of this seam. And since there is no borders on this quilt, I think I will backstitch a little bit at the beginning and end of the seam just to make sure that this doesn't come unraveled in the quilting process. And you don't need to take out those threads that we already have. You're just going to sew exactly right on top of them. I'm using Aurifil 50 weight, and I find that it is fine enough that it's okay to leave those threads in the seam allowance and in the stitching line. It hasn't caused a problem for me. If you're sewing with thicker thread and it becomes a problem, you could always remove those stitches, do them in a different color maybe, so that you can remove them. And I'm basically, at this point, there's no pins because my stitching has become my pins, and so I am just going from area that I've sewn to area that I've sewn, nice and slow, and making sure to stitch right on top of those stitches that I already made. And again, I'll backstitch since there are no borders. And here we go. I haven't pressed this yet, but it looks great. The two rows are together, and I don't think I'm going to press it yet. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead, add my 3rd row, then add my 4th row, my 5th row until my top is done, and then I will turn my iron back on and go ahead and press these 4 seams open to finish my quilt top. I went ahead and finished piecing my quilt top, and then I sent it off to Teresa Silva, who did an all-over quilting design. So just like that, I have a finished baby quilt, and I decided to bind it in the same blue that is my bee pieces, and I just love how it turned out. So Easy as that, we learned how to do a one-step block. And next up, we are going to move on to two-step blocks. Now that you've mastered one step, you're ready for two-step. So this is the table runner that is the apple pie table runner. We're going to work on this next week, and we're going to learn how to make this block, which is a two-step, has one A and two Bs. Might seem complicated, but it's not that hard, and I will walk you through every step of the way. And I really appreciate you being here to learn how to make the beach ball baby quilt. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, to leave your comments with us, and to subscribe to the channel. And if you have not yet signed up for the sew along worksheets, you can do that at the link posted in the video description below. And I will be back here in a couple days to teach you how to make the apple pie table runner. See you soon.